It was a stormy night, and I was driving home after my late shift at the 24-hour diner where I work. The shift had been unusually quiet, but I still felt strangely energized. I knew I'd have to take some melatonin when I got home to wind down. I was taking my usual route, a scenic road by day, but eerily dark at night due to the lack of streetlights. There were occasional small parking lots with charming little stores or family-run restaurants, and then long stretches of nothing but dense forest. As I was passing one of those parking lots in front of a familiar deli, I noticed a woman standing under a street lamp, waving me down. I slowed the car as I recognized that she was an older woman, perhaps in her mid-50s. She was tall, about 5 feet 11 inches or 6 feet, but very slender. I rolled down my window and called out, "Do you need a ride?" She walked over to the passenger side, opened the door, and started thanking me profusely, calling me a hero. I asked her where she was headed, and she said just a little further up the road, into town. She was soaking wet, and the water was dripping onto my car seats, but I pride myself on being a good person, so I couldn't leave her out there in the cold rain. Though, I have to admit, if it had been a man, I probably wouldn't have stopped. The woman seemed pleasant enough, but as we talked, I noticed she was missing a few teeth, which was quite unsettling. I started to wonder if she might be homeless. However, she didn't have the usual appearance or smell of someone who lived on the streets, but the rain could have been masking any odors, and her hair was so drenched that what might normally have been tangled was now plastered straight by the water. Still, she kept smiling and didn't seem like a threat. We soon reached an intersection where there was a gas station on the corner. I decided to pull in to fill up the tank. I asked if she wanted anything from inside, thinking I might as well do a good deed. She politely declined, calling me honey. I went inside, paid for the gas, and picked up some hard seltzers since it was almost the weekend. When I returned to the car, the woman was gone. I looked around the small parking lot, but she was nowhere to be found. She must have run off somewhere. I felt a bit guilty, thinking she might have been lost or in need of more help, but part of me was also relieved. I filled up the tank and drove home. Once I got back to my apartment, part of a 2-family house where I lived on the first floor, I hurried inside to escape the rain. I set down the seltzers, took a melatonin, and tried to get some sleep. But even with the melatonin, I found it hard to settle down. My mind kept wandering back to that woman and what might have happened to her. I heard some faint noises outside my bedroom door, but brushed them off, assuming they were from the tenant upstairs. In hindsight, I wish I had been more suspicious. I woke up in the middle of the night, which was unusual since melatonin usually knocked me out for hours. I felt drowsy and thirsty, so I reached for the water on my nightstand. That's when I saw something, or someone, in the corner of my bedroom, crouched behind a dresser with their legs folded. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I shook my head, made some weird noises, and even slapped my face, trying to snap out of it. But then the figure stood up and walked out of the room. I didn't scream. I didn't say a word. I just sat there in shock. The thing that bothered me most was the silence. No footsteps, no sound of a door closing. It was as if the figure had vanished. I grabbed my phone and called my dad, waking him up in the middle of the night. I told him what had happened, and he tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a night terror. I stayed on the phone with him as I got up, turned on all the lights in the living room, and checked the small apartment. No one was there. I started to think maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but I still locked my bedroom door before going back to bed. The next morning, after a restless night, I got up, made some coffee, and got ready to head to the gym. When I went to open the door to the foyer, I noticed it was already unlocked. My heart sank. What I saw last night, was it real? I searched the apartment again and found no one inside. I went out to my car to load my gym bag in the back seat, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The floor in the back was covered in damp, yellowish-brown stains, and the blanket I always kept back there was gone. I felt like screaming or crying. I pieced it together. The woman must have snuck into the back seat while I was in the gas station. She either found a way to unlock my apartment door, or I had foolishly left it unlocked. I called my dad again, frantic, asking what I should do. He told me to check if anything was stolen, and if not, there wasn't much the police could do. I searched the apartment once more. Nothing was missing, except the blanket from my car. I skipped the gym that day and stayed locked inside my apartment for days afterward. I was completely shaken. I couldn't stand living there much longer, so by the end of that month, I moved out and found a new place. A few months ago, something happened, and to this day, I'm not sure why I agreed to it. But I ended up going with my friend Jake to a house party he was attending during our first year of high school. I wasn't even invited, but Jake managed to get me in. Since I couldn't drive, I made the decision to ride along with him. When we arrived at the house late that night, Jake suggested I leave my phone in his car, saying it might get lost, or someone might take it if I wasn't paying attention. Although I was confused, I nodded and left my phone behind. We got out of the car and I followed Jake into the backyard where the party was going on. I looked around and saw people doing all kinds of things, smoking, drinking, and probably even using drugs in small groups. Jake urged me to mingle and say hi to some people. After a few hours, I realized I had way too much to drink. My vision was blurry and I felt unsteady. I moved closer to the house, leaning against the wall for support. I checked my watch. It was either midnight or 1 a.m. I knew I had to leave, so I started looking for Jake. Despite my growing exhaustion, I scanned the yard for him, but I couldn't find him anywhere. I asked a few people if they had seen Jake, but no one had. I decided to call him, but when I reached into my pocket, my phone wasn't there. I cursed myself because I had left it in Jake's car, and now both were gone. I realized my only option was to walk home since I remembered my house wasn't too far from here. But the night was cold, and it was fall. I thought about asking someone for a ride, but I didn't know anyone well enough to trust them, so I stuck with my plan to walk home in the dark. I made it to the road and started stumbling down the street. I knew I'd had too much to drink because I felt lightheaded and dizzy. A few minutes later, I reached the main street and kept walking. My thoughts started wandering to different things. Why had Jake left me alone at the party? Why did I listen to his stupid idea to leave my phone behind, leaving me unable to call him or anyone else? I began cursing myself for drinking so much, knowing it was a bad idea. I stopped walking, feeling tired, and crossed my arms tightly to keep warm. Then I remembered hitchhiking. I held out my thumb, hoping someone would stop. A few cars drove by, but none of them slowed down. As more time passed, I felt increasingly uneasy, thinking I might have to keep walking. It was past 1 a.m., and although a few cars were driving by, no one stopped, either because they didn't notice me or didn't care. I hesitated, thinking about walking home again, but in my drunken state, it felt impossible. I was still holding out my thumb when a grey truck pulled up in front of me. I smiled and stumbled toward the vehicle. The window rolled down, revealing an older man with a beard who asked if I needed a ride. I told him yes and explained where my house was before getting into the truck, feeling relieved to have a ride. As we drove down the road, the man tried making small talk, asking what had happened to me. But I was too disoriented to have a real conversation, only managing to mumble and groan in response. As we turned onto my street, away from the party, I started feeling uneasy for no clear reason. Something about the man felt off. Suddenly, we drove past my house. and I told him we had just missed it. My gut screamed at me to get out, but I was too drunk to move. I was about to tell him to stop and let me out when he turned to me with a sinister look. "You know," he said with a dark smirk, "you shouldn't be hitchhiking when you're drunk. You'd make an easy target." He reached over and started rubbing my leg. I didn't know what he was planning, but I knew it wasn't good. Before he could do anything else, a loud siren blared behind us and flashing red and blue lights filled the night. I realized it was the police and felt a rush of relief. The man panicked, stopped the truck, and unlocked the doors, allowing me to jump out and run. The police officer rushed over to me, and I explained everything that had happened. Unfortunately, nothing technically illegal had occurred by that point. The officer told me they were looking for someone in a grey truck who had stolen something from a store. I don't know if it was the same man who picked me up or someone else, but I was just glad the officer had intervened. The cop gave me a ride home, and from that moment on, I swore I would never get so drunk that I couldn't think straight. I learned the importance of staying responsible and aware of my surroundings, even when just trying to have a good time. Back when I was still in college, something happened that I'll never forget. I attended a large university in the Midwest, known for its party scene. I wasn't in a sorority, but I went to plenty of fraternity parties. I went through a heavy drinking phase in college, and while I've left it behind, I can't help but feel relieved that I got it out of my system back then. There was this one fraternity party coming up that my friends Jess and Olivia were excited about. It was a Sigma Alpha party, and they insisted we go. I was always up for a party, unless I was too hungover to function, and even then, sometimes I'd still go out. I was living off campus in a house with 3 other girls. We weren't part of any official group, just 4 friends renting a place together. We pre-gamed pretty heavily at our house before calling an Uber. We split the fare, and on the way to the party, we kept drinking, which was a recipe for disaster. By the time we arrived, I was on the verge of blacking out. I barely remember the layout of the Sigma Alpha house, since it was my first and only time there. My memories of that night are spotty at best. I vaguely recall seeing a group of frat guys standing outside, then a DJ in the living room, and 2 beer pong tables set up in the kitchen. I later found out that I played beer pong with some random guy and ended up talking to him in a corner for a large part of the night. But after that, no one seems to know where I went. I can't even remember the last thing I did before waking up on the side of the road, lying on the grass in a daze. My head was pounding, and I was still somewhat intoxicated. It was pitch black, and I was lying near a wooded area, away from any buildings or familiar landmarks. There were a few streetlights down the road, so I wasn't completely in the dark, but I was far from anywhere I knew. I patted my pockets, searching for my phone, and panic set in when I realized they were empty. My crossbody bag was also gone. I had nothing on me. Fear gripped me as I realized I couldn't call for help, didn't know what time it was, or even where I was. I looked around, but saw nothing useful in my immediate surroundings. My white shirt was stained with dirt, but that was the least of my worries. I began walking toward the nearest streetlight, hoping to figure out where I was. As I walked, I became more aware of how isolated I was. There were no buildings, just trees and darkness. I leaned against the light pole, trying to think of what to do next. I decided to wait for a car to pass by so I could ask for help, but it took what felt like forever before I saw headlights in the distance. I stepped into the road, waving my arms frantically to get the driver's attention. The car slowed down and stopped beside me. I approached cautiously, and the driver rolled down the window. It was a man, probably in his mid-30s, with a thin goatee and a large nose. He asked if I was okay, and I quickly told him I was stranded without a phone and needed a ride home. He told me to get in, and I did, feeling a wave of relief. As we drove, he started asking me about my situation, how I ended up stranded on the side of the road. I explained that I had been at a party, and the next thing I knew, I woke up on the side of the road. In hindsight, I should have been more careful with what I said. I shouldn't have let him know how vulnerable I was. When he asked why I didn't call for help, I told him I lost my phone. He looked at me with a strange expression that made me uncomfortable. This was the first time I really took a good look at him. He wasn't particularly attractive, and something about his demeanor was unsettling. I gave him my address, and he entered it into his GPS. As he did, I heard him mutter under his breath, "Okay, here we go." I asked how far away we were, and he said it was about 20 minutes, which seemed right since the fraternity house was about 20 minutes from where I lived. I thought everything would go smoothly from there, that I'd be dropped off at home where Jess and Olivia would be waiting with my belongings. But nothing is ever that simple. The man spoke in a soft voice, almost too gentle, as he asked me more questions. His voice was unsettling, like he was trying too hard to be calm. We kept driving on the same road, but after what felt like more than 20 minutes, I started to worry. I asked him again how much further we had to go, but he didn't respond right away. When I repeated the question, he finally said in that same soft voice, "Not far." Something wasn't right. We should have been in town by now, but we were still on the same deserted road, surrounded by nothing but trees. I noticed, out of the corner of my eye, that he kept turning his head to look at me, staring for a few seconds before looking back at the road. A sick feeling rose in my stomach. I asked if he had put in the right address, and he said yes. Then, without warning, he asked, "What color underwear are you wearing?" as he reached over and started rubbing my knee. I quickly moved my leg away and, in a desperate voice, begged him not to hurt me, saying I just wanted to get home safely. He replied, "Why would I hurt you?" Then he pulled the car onto the grass at the side of the road and put it in park. He started leaning toward me, reaching out like he was going to touch me, but I didn't wait to find out what he planned to do. I opened the door and ran into the woods. Luckily, I was wearing sneakers, so running through the trees wasn't too difficult. I ran just far enough to be out of sight from the car and crouched down, trying to stay hidden. I could hear the man yelling into the woods, "Where are you? I just want to talk." I covered my mouth with my hands to muffle my breathing and stifle my sobs of fear. I stayed there, barely breathing, until I heard the car door slam and the sound of the engine as he sped off. After waiting a little longer to make sure he was gone, I cautiously walked back to the road. I was truly terrified and didn't want to encounter him again, but I knew I needed help. I waited at the edge of the woods until I saw another car approaching. I watched carefully, making sure it was a different car before stepping out and waving my arms to flag it down. The car stopped, and this time it was an older man. I sat in the back seat, too shaken to talk much, only answering his questions with short, quiet responses. Thankfully, this man drove me straight home. By the time I got back, it was 4 a.m. Jess and Olivia were still awake, worried about me. They had my phone and bag and had been considering calling the police if I didn't return by morning. No one had any idea who I left with or how I ended up on the side of the road. The guy I had been talking to at the party claimed he didn't leave with me. There was no clear explanation for how I ended up alone on the road. After that night, I cut back on drinking significantly. I never want to be in a situation again where I'm so vulnerable that I have to rely on a stranger to get home.